1.1 Introduction. What comes to your mind when you come across the word forensic psychology? Maybe the word forensic brings to your mind the X-Files and crime-related series or detective series and movies. Well, to some extent yes. In these crime-related series and movies, there are often individuals involved who look at the crime or the possible criminal from a psychological perspective. Though it can be said that forensic psychology is much more scientific and deeper than what is shown in these series and movies, that are based on crime and so on. Forensic psychology can be explained as a branch of psychology and involves systematic and scientific study of human behavior in the context of law, crime and so on. Let us try to have an idea about forensic psychology with the help of the following conversation between Anjali and her friends. Anjali returned home after a much busy day and was now on the way to meet her school friends, John, Nafisa, Mahima, Garima, Manjit and Lily. It was like an informal alumni meet and Anjali was looking forward to it. At the restaurant, one by one all the friends arrived and started interacting with each other. Let us look at their conversation. John: wow, it's so nice to meet you all after so long. This was a much-awaited get-together. Garima: well, John, we could have met earlier, if you did not have a busy schedule as you do. John: well, I work for an MNC and you know the pressure. And by the way, you were also in field. So it's not my fault entirely that we could not meet. Garima: oh yes, I was posted in Bangalore. It is just that now I got my leave. Lily, smiling: better late than never. All in unison: that's true. All were busy talking, but Anjali was a bit quiet. Manjit, jokingly: hey guys, be careful about what you speak, we have two psychologists amongst us. Mahima: well, don't worry Manjit, me and Anjali are not judging you, and besides, Anjali is not just a psychologist, she is a forensic psychologist. Manjit: wow. Sounds pretty complex. Mahima: well, it is a very challenging field. Lily: so Anjali, can you tell us more about this forensic psychology and how it is different from what Mahima is doing? She is also a psychologist, right? Anjali: well, forensic psychology is a field where psychology is applied to the legal system. Mahima: Lily: I have done my MA in psychology and later did my PhD in psychology and now I am into teaching. But Anjali after her graduation did Masters of Science in Forensic Psychology and further trained in the field. John: wow, that is really commendable. But what exactly do you do? Do you test DNA, collect fingerprints and other evidence? Are you like a detective? Anjali, laughing: no John, of course not. As a forensic psychologist we have various functions, like carrying out criminal investigation, analysis of crime, profiling of offenders. We are also involved in detection of malingering or deception, interviewing eyewitness and expert witness. We also work in area of police psychology. We basically use the principles, assessment and techniques from psychology and apply them to legal system. Manjit: wow, that's quite a lot of work. So is it more of an independent work? Anjali: actually no, we do work closely with police, lawyers, judges and others involved in legal system besides doctors, psychiatrists and even clinical psychologists. John: well, you seem to be more busy than me. Mahima: well, John, that depends on your perspective. All jobs are important and require you to put in effort. In case of Anjali, being a forensic psychologist does have its responsibilities as well-being and freedom on individuals could depend on the interpretations made by him/her. Lily: really interesting. And wish you all the best, dear Anjali. Anjali, smiling: thanks dear friends. I do need your best wishes." And the conversation between the friends continued. From the above conversation, you must have developed some idea about forensic psychology. But let us learn more about this significant branch of psychology. In the very first unit of this course, we will try to understand the scope and nature of forensic psychology and look at its subspecialities. Ethical issues in forensic psychology will also be discussed. 1.2 Nature and scope of forensic psychology. The word forensic originated from a Latin word forensis that meant of the forum. It mainly referred to a place where disputes were resolved, something similar to the courts in the present day. A simple way in which forensic psychology can be described is as application of principles of psychology to legal system. Many people confuse forensic psychology with forensic science. Although the two are closely related, there are many differences. The primary difference is that while forensic scientists are in the business of applying the chemical and biological sciences to law enforcement, national security, defense, or intelligence work, forensic psychologists delve into the psychological perspectives of human behavior and apply them to the legal systems. It can also be explained as application of psychology to the criminal and civil justice systems. Criminal justice system includes three parts, viz. Police, court and prison. Walker and Shapiro defined forensic psychology as the study that involves integration of psychology and law. Thus, the two fields, that is psychology which can be described as empirical and systematic study of human behavior, is merged or integrated with law that can be described as the study of how individuals rule themselves in social settings. Polizzi and Draper stated that forensic psychology attempts to provide expert opinion and explanation based upon established knowledge within the discipline of psychology as this relates to the topics of criminal law, family law and civil liability law. Forensic psychology is the professional practice by any psychologist working within any subdiscipline of psychology, for example, clinical, developmental, social, cognitive, when applying the scientific, technical or specialized knowledge of psychology to the law to assist in addressing legal, contractual and administrative matters. Forensic psychology is the intersection between psychology and the criminal justice system. It involves understanding criminal law in the relevant jurisdictions in order to be able to interact appropriately with judges, attorneys and the legal professionals. An important aspect of forensic psychology is the ability to testify in court, reformulating psychological findings into the legal language of the courtroom, providing information to legal personnel in a way that can be understood. Further, in order to be credible witness, the forensic psychologist must understand the philosophy, rules and standards of the judicial system. Questions asked by the court to a forensic psychologist are generally not questions regarding psychology but are legal questions, and the response must be in language the court understands. For example, a forensic psychologist is frequently appointed by the court to assess a defendant's competency to stand trial. The court also frequently appoints a forensic psychologist to assess the state of mind of the defendant at the time of the offense. This is referred to as an evaluation of the defendant's sanity or insanity, which relates to criminal responsibility at the time of the offense. These are not primarily psychological questions but rather legal ones. Thus, a forensic psychologist must be able to translate psychological information into a legal framework. Forensic psychologists provide sentencing recommendations, treatment recommendations and any other information the judge requests. Forensic psychology also involves training and evaluating police or other law enforcement personnel. Forensic psychologists may also help with jury selection. Forensic psychology knowledge is used in various forms, such as in treating mentally ill offenders, consulting with attorneys, for example, on picking a jury, analyzing a criminal's mind and intent, and practicing within the civil arena. A forensic psychologist may also choose to solely focus his/her career on research, ranging anywhere from examination of eyewitness testimony to learning how to improve interrogation methods. Another form of forensic psychology work is in public policy, where researchers can help in the design of correctional facilities and prisons. The role of a forensic psychologist in simple terms can be explained as assisting the legal system. The forensic psychologist views the client or defendant from a different point of view than does a traditional clinical psychologist. Seeing the situation from the client's point of view or empathizing is not the forensic psychologist's task. Traditional psychological tests and interview procedure are not sufficient when applied to the forensic situation. In forensic evaluations, it is important to assess the consistency of factual information across multiple sources. Forensic evaluators must be able to provide the source on which any information is based. Unlike more traditional applications of clinical psychology, informed consent is not required when the assessment is ordered by the court. Instead, the defendant simply needs to be notified regarding the purpose of the evaluation and the fact that he/she will have no control over how the information obtained is used. While psychologists infrequently have to be concerned about the malingering or feigning illness in non-criminal clinical setting, a forensic psychologist must be able to recognize exaggerated or faked symptoms. Malingering exists on a continuum, so that forensic psychologist must be skilled in recognizing varying degrees of feigned symptoms. Thus, forensic psychologists perform a wide range of tasks within the criminal justice system. By far the largest is that of preparing for and providing testimony in the courtroom. This task has become increasingly difficult as attorneys have become sophisticated at undermining psychological testimony. Evaluating the client, preparing for testimony, and the testimony itself require the forensic psychologist to have a firm grasp of the law and the legal situation at issue in the courtroom, using the crime classification manual and other sources. 1.2.1 Relationship between psychology and law. As mentioned by us earlier, that forensic psychology is application of principles of psychology to legal system. Thus, it is important to also focus on the relationship between psychology and law. In the past several decades, collaboration between psychology and law has grown prodigiously. The number of journals, textbooks, and continuing education workshops available in forensic psychology has increased. In recent years, there has been a shift in the focus of clinical psychology from investigating anxiety, neurotic, and schizophrenic conditions to studying character disorders, examining externalizing versus internalizing styles of personality, generally, and criminal and violent behavior specifically. As the public's interest in crime increased, clinical psychologists broadened their interests to include forensic questions and criminal behavior. There are three ways in which psychology and law interact: A. The practice of psychology in legal settings, psychology in the law. B. The effects of law on the practice of psychology, psychology by the law. C. Research and scholarly inquiry as applied to legal issues, psychology of the law. There are epistemological differences between law and psychology. Both lawyers and psychologists need to understand these differences for their collaborations to meet with success. We can establish a functional definition of forensic psychology by describing in the above three ways how psychology and law interact: psychology in the law, psychology by the law, and psychology of the law. Let us deal with these three ways in some detail. Some psychologists practice in a legal setting and must be aware of and knowledgeable about legal issues. Expert witnesses are an example. Expert witnesses must be familiar with legal standards, definitions, and tests and the procedures by which the law operates. They must be aware of specific ethical parameters that govern forensic psychology practice, particularly where such practice differs from traditional clinical or experimental practices. Psychologists must be aware of the way law has increased its influence on their daily functioning, whether in clinical practice, in academia, or in research contexts. The psychologist must continue to follow refinements in the law as they affect practice and, because state law and local customs shape legal and ethical practice, to learn about the law as applicable where the psychologist practices. The third area that is subsumed under forensic psychology concerns scholarly inquiry into what has been termed psycholegal issues. Psychologists have applied research methodologies to a number of legal questions and practices. Literature concerning juror selection and jury dynamics, privacy, and discretion show applications of psychology studying the law. 1.2.2 Forensic psychology and related fields. Forensic psychology can be related with various other fields like clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology and social psychology. In this section we will discuss about how forensic psychology can be related to these major branches in psychology. Within the general field of psychology there are a wide range of different disciplines. Two such disciplines are clinical psychology and forensic psychology. Clinical psychology differs from forensic psychology in that the general purpose of clinical psychology is to diagnose and treat psychological dysfunction, whereas the purpose of forensic psychology is to provide the psychological assessments in legal situations. A clinical psychologist is bound by an oath of confidentiality to the patients that he/she sees and is motivated by a desire to help those patients find accurate diagnosis and appropriate treatment for any emotional or mental issue that is disrupting their lives. A forensic psychologist acts in the capacity of an expert witness in psychological matters as they relate to criminal proceedings. Forensic psychology and clinical psychology. Forensic psychology and clinical psychology both got their start in the same general time period, the late 1800s. The first true clinical psychologist was Leitner Whitmer, who was a former student of Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology. Whitmer was the head of the psychology department at the University of Pennsylvania when he/she began this groundbreaking work with a boy that had trouble spelling. His tireless work was the first time that psychological research was applied in the therapeutic setting, and led to him/her opening the first psychological clinic in 1896 as has already been mentioned. The first known use of the forensic psychology came when Albert von Schrenck-Notzing testified at a murder trial on the negative impact of publicity on the memories of the witness accounts. He/she was the first to suggest, in court, that too much press surrounding an event could lead to a retroactive memory falsification. Essentially, his view was that the witness would have a hard time distinguishing what they actually seen from what had been reported in the press. This very issue is still at the heart of many legal battles today. It is interesting to note that Hugo Munsterberg, who was another student of Wundt, opened a clinic in 1892 with the goal of introducing psychology to the courtroom. He/she was largely laughed at but continued championing his cause for many, many years. In the context of how forensic psychology can be related to clinical psychology, we can also discuss about clinical forensic psychology. Clinical forensic psychology is the subfield that most people are familiar with, even though they are not even aware of it. There are a variety of things to do with this area. Just like a clinical psychologist, clinical forensic psychologists are mainly interested in assessing and treating people suffering from some form of mental illness. The difference is that the people being treated are also being assessed because they are somehow involved in the criminal justice system, mainly because of conviction for some offense. Most people in the subfield decide to make treatment and assessment the focus of their career in life. Offenders can be forcibly treated while in prisons, corrections facilities, as a requirement of parole forward/probation, or in a hospital. Alternatively, offenders could see a clinical forensic psychologist who operates in private practice. Forensic psychology and cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology is a discipline within psychology that investigates the internal mental processes of thought such as visual processing, memory, thinking, learning, feeling, problem solving, and language. Cognitive psychologists use psychophysical and experimental approaches to understand, diagnose and solve problems, concerning themselves with the mental processes which mediate between stimulus and response. Cognitive theory contends that solutions to problems take the form of algorithms, rules that are not necessarily understood but promise a solution, heuristics, rules that are understood but that do not always guarantee solutions. In other instances, solutions may be found through insight, a sudden awareness of relationships. Modern cognitive psychology has been deeply influenced by the work of Noam Chomsky, Albert Bandura, and Ulrich Nietzsche. Forensic psychology is tied closest to the cognitive perspective. The cognitive perspective was developed by George Miller, Jerome Bruner, and Ulrich Nietzsche throughout the 1990s. It focused on identifying the process of thinking, language, and dreams, with the main idea that perceptions and thoughts influence behavior. Forensic psychologists not only offer their expert opinion at trials, but can also be found helping a witness identifying a murderer in a line of suspects. They sometimes hypnotize individuals to help them remember things or interview potential. They could also help jury members to eliminate those who may be biased. These tasks relate to the cognitive activities of thinking, memory and perceptions. Other times, they give their own expert testimony at trials which could result in an individual being confined to a mental institution, receive huge monetary awards, obtain custody of a child, or lose his or her life. Legal psychologists play a big role in the justice system. Forensic psychologists often work within the judicial system in such diverse areas as determining an inmate's readiness for parole, evaluation of rehabilitation programs, clinical competency, tort liability and damages, evidence, jury selection, and police training. The evaluations of the mental state of individuals also communicate the cognitive perspective. They may also be employed in other areas of jurisprudence, including patent and trademark disputes, divorce and custody cases, product liability, and taxation. Psychologists advise their clients in several ways, including diagnostic appraisals, which may determine the capability of the client to stand trial. They are also called to provide clinically based opinions on a wide variety of issues arising from their diagnoses. Sometimes they obtain hospital records, police reports, witness statements, and provide relevant research. Besides submitting these and other findings, they are often required to testify in court. Forensic psychologist may be hired by a defense attorney to evaluate the defendant's mental processes. They administer personality and intelligence tests after being briefed on the circumstances of the crime and examining records detailing the mental or emotional problems and treatment. Forensic psychology can also be tied to ideas of structuralism. That is, structure of conscious experience, such as witnessing a crime, objective sensation seeing, touching, testing, hearing and subjective feelings like memories and thoughts. Forensic psychologists determine whether or not people are telling the truth with the use of polygraph machines, lie detector The machine records a person's physical response to questions. The lie detector measures blood pressure, breathing, electrical conductivity of the skin, pulse and perspiration in order to tell if a person is lying or not. This aspect of forensics especially ties back to the cognitive perspective and conscious thoughts. If the enquired party does not provide accurate answers, then their body's reaction gives them away. Forensic psychology is most directly related to the cognitive perspective because most of this profession deals with mentality, memories and conscious thoughts. Psychologists assess witnesses and suspects for accuracy in objective thoughts and help enhance memories to uncover the truth and put away the bad guys. Forensic psychology and developmental psychology. Developmental psychology, also known as human development, is the scientific study of systematic psychological changes that occur in human beings over the course of their lifespan. Originally concerned with infants and children, the field has expanded to include adolescence, adult development, aging and the entire lifespan. This field examines change across a broad range of topics including motor skills and other psychophysiological processes, cognitive development involving areas such as problem solving, moral understanding, and conceptual understanding, language acquisition, social, personality, and emotional development, and self-concept and identity formation. Developmental psychology includes issues such as the extent to which development occurs through the gradual accumulation of knowledge versus stage-like development, or the extent to which children are born with innate mental structures versus learning through experience. Many researchers are interested in the interaction between personal characteristics, the individual's behavior, and environmental factors including social context, and their impact on development. Others take a more narrowly focused approach. Developmental psychology can be related to several applied fields, including educational psychology, child psychopathology, and forensic developmental psychology. Developmental psychology complements several other basic research fields in psychology including social psychology, cognitive psychology, ecological psychology, and comparative psychology. Recent developments in the field of forensic developmental psychology challenge traditional conceptions about the reliability of children's reports. The areas covered involve the disclosure patterns of sexually abused children, the nature of suggestive interviews, developmental differences in suggestibility, and the amount of suggestion required to produce false reports and beliefs. Forensic developmental psychology is a field that has emerged over the past 2 decades. The term was developed by Brook and Poole and includes autobiographical memory, memory distortion, eyewitness identification, narrative construction, personality, and attachment as topics covered by this field of research. Forensic developmental psychology is oriented toward children's actions and reactions in forensic contexts. The research is grounded in a developmental framework, and is emerging either from previous studies in basic developmental science or from related research in the adult literature. The major topics in this field of research include the conditions that precipitate false reports, the psychological status of false reports, and developmental trends in false reports. Forensic psychology and social psychology. Social psychology studies the nature and causes of social behavior. Social psychology is the study of social behavior and mental processes, with an emphasis on how humans think about each other and how they relate to each other. Social psychologists are especially interested in how people react to social situations. They study such topics as the influence of others on an individual's behavior, for example, conformity, persuasion, and the formation of beliefs, attitudes, and stereotypes about other people. Social cognition fuses elements of social and cognitive psychology in order to understand how people process, remember, and distort social information. The study of group dynamics reveals information about the nature and potential optimization of leadership, communication, and other phenomena that emerge at least at the microsocial level. In recent years, many social psychologists have become increasingly interested in implicit measures, mediational models, and the interaction of both person and social variables in accounting for behavior. Social psychology is the scientific study of how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. By this definition, scientific refers to the empirical method of investigation. The terms thoughts, feelings, and behaviors include all of the psychological variables that are measurable in a human being. The statement that others may be imagined or implied suggests that we are prone to social influence even when no other people are present, such as when watching television, or following internalized cultural norms. Social psychologists typically explain human behavior as a result of the interaction of mental states and immediate social situations. In Kurt Lewin's famous heuristic formula, behavior can be viewed as a function of the person and the environment, B = F, P, E. In general, social psychologists have a preference for laboratory-based, empirical findings. Social psychology theories tend to be specific and focused, rather than global and general. Social psychology is an interdisciplinary domain that bridges the gap between psychology and sociology. During the years immediately following World War II, there was frequent collaboration between psychologists and sociologists. However, the two disciplines have become increasingly specialized and isolated from each other in recent years, with sociologists focusing on macro variables, for example social structure, to a much greater extent. Nevertheless, sociological approaches to social psychology remain an important counterpart to psychological research in this area. Social psychology has a vast application in legal setup. Psychologists may play a role in advising lawyers and courts on matters of witness credibility, jury selection, and how external factors can affect eyewitness memory. Periodically, social psychologists act as trial consultants or offer counsel regarding legal policy. Social psychologists have learned that persons who confess or who provide information as a result of being subjected to abuse do not necessarily provide reliable information. The psychology of the false confessions has attracted considerable research interest in recent years, with the realization that a surprising number of suspects confess to crimes they did not commit. Forensic psychologists consulting with law enforcement may be able to offer interrogation strategies that will protect the rights of suspects and minimize the likelihood that a false confession will occur. From the above discussion, you must have developed a fair idea about the nature and scope of forensic psychology. In the next subsection, we will focus on various subspecialities of forensic psychology. 1.3 Subspecialities in forensic psychology. Let us briefly look at the subspecialities in forensic psychology. These will be covered in detail in the rest of the units of this course. Police psychology. One of the first subspecialities that we could discuss is police psychology. As the name suggests, this has to do with police. Police psychology as a subject focuses in various aspects of enforcement of law that includes government agencies at local, state and federal levels. Police psychology also relates to the employment-related aspects of police personnel. Thus, right from recruitment to selection, police personality, police stress, assessment and evaluation of psychological entities like intelligence etc. of the police personnel is covered in police psychology. Police psychologists to a greater extent are also involved in training police personnel. They may also play a role in provide counseling and therapeutic interventions to police personnel as and when required. We will discuss about police psychology in detail in Unit 7 of this course. Investigative psychology. Yet another subspeciality in forensic psychology is investigative psychology, and this also will be discussed in detail in Unit 8 of this course. But to briefly discuss or introduce investigative psychology, it is application of principles of psychology to the process of criminal investigation. Thus, it mainly involves gathering of information from crime scene and decision-making in that regard, which is then applied in order to carry out criminal behavior analysis. Thus, an investigative psychologist can play a role in developing greater understanding about criminal behavior, and they can contribute greatly to the process of investigation. Investigative psychologists are often involved in examination of patterns and styles as reflected by the criminal so as to develop a better understanding about the psychological characteristics and thought process of the criminal. Criminal psychology. This is a subsection that is often interchangeably used in place of forensic psychology. Though both the fields vary, criminal psychology is a subspecialty under forensic psychology. Criminal psychology will be discussed in detail in Units 4 and 5 of this course. Criminal psychology mainly focuses on the behavior, thought process and patterns of the criminal. Criminal psychologists are thus involved in seeking answers to why the criminal behaved the way he/she did. Criminal psychologists are often involved in profiling, consultations and research, assessment of mental health and other psychological entities, proving counseling and psychotherapy, and they could also be involved in giving testimonies in the court. Legal psychology. Another subspecialty under forensic psychology that is closely related to forensic psychology is legal psychology. In legal psychology, the concepts and principles of psychology are applied to legal system. Legal psychologists often advise judges and individuals from legal system in making decisions. Eyewitness assessment, that will be covered in Unit 9, can be categorized under legal psychology. To differentiate between forensic psychology and legal psychology, forensic psychology mainly focuses on the criminal or the offender, and legal psychology focuses on the through process of the judges, legal process, legal system and so on. Correctional psychology. The last subspecialty of forensic psychology that we will discuss is correctional psychology. The focus of correctional psychology, as the name suggests, is on treatment and management of the criminals or offenders. Thus, the concepts and principles of psychology are applied for correctional purposes. Correctional psychology would include topics related to the prison and prison setup, and also interventions for the inmates and offenders. Correctional psychology will be discussed in Unit 10 of this course. 1.4 Ethical issues in forensic psychology. Professions use ethics codes to regulate, educate, and inspire their practitioners. When the public grants a trust to a profession, the profession assumes an obligation to practice in a way that serves the public and not merely the individual professional's appetites. Privileged communication is granted to allow the public to consult professionals without fear that their intimate disclosures will be revealed. Surgeons are allowed to cut into human flesh to serve the patient's medical needs. This trust is not granted irrevocably or unconditionally. The conditions are that the profession regulate itself by developing norms, values, standards, and practices that shape the individual practitioner. The profession does not genetically produce the next generation of practitioners, but it does produce its next generation of professionals through socialization. Although the ultimate responsibility for ethical conduct is and must remain with the individual practitioner, the promotion of ethical conduct is the province of the profession. Yet, codes are restrictive and conserve a profession's values. While preserving minimal skill levels to practice, they can be used to stifle creativity and foster greed. A forensic psychologist generally practices within the confines of the courtroom, incarceration facilities, and other legal setting. It is important to remember that the forensic psychologist is equally likely to be testifying for the prosecution as for the defense attorney. A forensic psychologist does not take a side, as do the psychologists. The ethical standards for a forensic psychologist differ for those of a clinical psychologist or other practicing psychologist because the forensic psychologist is not an advocate for the client and nothing the client says is guaranteed to be kept confidential. This makes evaluation of the client difficult, as the forensic psychologist needs and wants to obtain certain information while it is often not in the client's best interest to provide it. The client has no control over how that information is used. Despite the signing of a waiver of confidentiality, most clients do not realize the nature of the evaluative situation. Furthermore, the interview techniques differ from those typical of a clinical psychologist and require an understanding of the criminal mind and criminal and violent behavior. For example, even indicating to a defendant being interviewed that an effort will be made to get the defendant professional help may be grounds for excluding the expert's testimony. In addition, the forensic psychologist deals with a range of clients unlike those of the average practicing psychologist. Because the client base is by and large criminal, the forensic psychologist is immersed in an abnormal world. As such, the population evaluated by the forensic psychologist is heavily weighted with specific personality disorders. The typical grounds for malpractice suits also apply to the forensic psychologist, such as wrongful commitment, inadequate informed consent, duty and breach of duty, and standards of care issues. Some situations are more clear-cut for forensic psychologist. The duty to warn, which is mandated by many states, is generally not a problem because the client or defendant has already signed a release of information, unless the victim is not clearly identified and the issue of identifiability of the victim arises. However, in general the forensic psychologist is less likely to encounter malpractice suits than a clinical psychologist. The forensic psychologist does have some additional professional liability issues. As mentioned above, confidentiality in a forensic setting is more complicated than in a clinical setting as the client or defendant is apt to misinterpret the limits of confidentiality despite being warned and signing a release. There are 5 ethical principles in the APA Principles and Code. The 5 ethical principles are these: 1. Beneficence and maleficence, safeguard the welfare and rights of others and maintain vigilance in seeing the psychologist's influence is not misused. 2. Responsibility, establish trust with clients, clarify roles and obligations, coordinate services with other professionals to the client's benefit, see to the general ethical probity of colleagues, and provide some measure of pro bono service. 3. Integrity, promote truthfulness in research, teaching, and service, avoid dishonesty, deception, subterfuge, and misrepresenting, and where any such activities are necessary, be sure the benefits outweigh the costs and client damage is minimized or repaired. 4. Justice, allow equal access to services by the advantaged and the disadvantaged alike, and take reasonable care that any biases and limitations to competence or expertise do not harm recipients of the services. 5. Respect for people's rights and dignity, respect the dignity, worth, and rights of all people to privacy and autonomy, apply safeguards to protect the vulnerable or impaired, maintain awareness for cultural, individual, and role-driven differences so biases do not adversely affect the client. When applying the principles to cases, it becomes clear that they have considerable overlap and that cases illustrating one principle frequently have applicability to others. It is only a bit less entangling to see how the ethical standards help guide the forensic psychologist. 1.5 Let us sum up. To summarize, in the present unit we discussed about forensic psychology. Forensic psychology can be described as the intersection between psychology and the criminal justice system. It involves understanding criminal law in the relevant jurisdictions in order to be able to interact appropriately with judges, attorneys and the legal professionals. The nature and scope of forensic psychology was also discussed, and the unit focused on the relationship between psychology and law. Forensic psychology and related fields were also discussed, and in this context forensic psychology was related with clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology and social psychology. The unit further discussed about the subspecialties in forensic psychology, including police psychology, investigative psychology, criminal psychology, legal psychology and correctional psychology. Lastly, the ethical issues in forensic psychology were discussed.